People in Redwood Bluff still talk about him like he was some kind of lunatic. An old, lonely man living in a wooden cabin at the end of the red dirt road, where the wind blew all year and no one ever stayed long enough to finish a cup of coffee. His name was Elias Boone. He used to be a cowboy once, used to have everything. And then, one day, he lost it all. No one remembers when it all began. They only know that every morning, anyone walking past that porch would see him sitting there. Same chair, same old coffee cup, same eyes fixed on the western road that disappeared into the desert. A road nobody traveled, leading nowhere. The children called it the Ghost Road. The grown-ups, when they passed, would usually bow their heads a little, maybe out of pity, maybe out of fear of the kind of waiting that lasts too long, quiet and steady, until time itself stops mattering. I first heard his story from Martha Hale, the grocer's wife. She used to bring him milk every week. She said, "He doesn't talk much, just asks if anyone's heard news from Mesa." I asked, "What kind of news?" And he said, "If anyone saw a woman with brown hair passing through." Then she sighed and lowered her voice. "They say he had a wife once. She left, told him she'd come back when the first rain fell. But every year there's only wind." I met Elias one afternoon in June. The wind carried the smell of red dust, and sunlight broke across the wooden planks like shattered gold. He was sitting there exactly as everyone had described, back straight, coffee in hand, eyes listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. I asked, just to break the silence, "Are you still waiting for someone?" He didn't turn to look at me. "Not someone," he said, "just in the one I promised I wouldn't leave." I said nothing. There was something in his voice, slow, deep, so honest it made me feel ashamed for asking. He told me her name was Lydia. She'd left Redwood Bluff 25 years ago, during the driest season anyone could remember. They'd built a small ranch together by the dry creek bed. But when the drought came, everything collapsed. The cattle died, the land cracked, and people started leaving. Lydia too. She told him, "I'll come back, Eli, when the sky learns how to be kind again." Then she left, carrying a small suitcase and a wedding photo faded by the sun. 25 years, Redwood Bluff had changed. Children were born, grew up, and moved away. But Elias stayed. The cabin had been repainted 3 times. The porch planks replaced, but the chair he sat in every day, was still the first one. Old, split, but strong. People tried to convince him to sell the place, to move into town. He only shook his head. "If she comes back and doesn't find me here, then waiting means nothing." They said he was crazy, but I wasn't so sure, because in his eyes, I saw something that sane men rarely have. Absolute faith. Not faith in others. Faith in his own promise. That night I stayed a while with him. The sky over Redwood Bluff burned red as the sun sank behind the hills. Elias sat quiet for a long time before asking, "Do you believe someone can really come back after all those years?" "I don't know," I said. "But if anyone can make another wait 25 years, they must have loved the right person." He smiled, a small, tired, gentle smile. "I'm not waiting to be loved again. I'm waiting to keep my word, even if I'm the only one who remembers." I looked up. Dark clouds were gathering from the south. A rare sight around here. Maybe, just maybe, it was going to rain. The next morning, people passing by his house saw him on the porch, just like always. Except this time, there was no coffee cup in his hand. Only a small photograph resting on his knee. The picture was old, corners worn, showing two people standing in front of that same cabin. Lydia smiling, her hair caught in the wind, her hands still dusted with flour. That afternoon, for the first time in over 4 years, rain began to fall over Redwood Bluff. The whole town stopped and stared. And Elias, he just smiled. "I told you," he whispered. "She said she'd come back when the first rain fell." That night, Redwood Bluff smelled of wet earth. The first rain in years came down slow, careful almost, as if the sky was afraid of breaking something sacred. Every drop hitting the tin roof sounded like the heartbeat of the whole town. Elias sat on his porch, just like always. The warm glow from inside the cabin spilled across his weathered face. Rain soaked his hair and shirt, but he didn't move. He was afraid that if he stepped away, the thing he'd waited for would disappear like fog in the morning sun. When thunder rolled softly in the distance, he finally heard something besides the rain. Hoofbeats, slow, uneven, then stopping right at his gate. A figure stood in the downpour, wrapped in a dark cloak. Elias narrowed his eyes, unsure if he was dreaming. A voice called out, shaky, familiar enough to make his chest tighten. "Eli, is that you?" He didn't answer. He rose from the chair, step by step, until he stood at the edge of the porch. The rain fell harder, hiding her face. But when lightning flashed, he saw her eyes. The same eyes he hadn't forgotten in 25 long years. "Lydia." She smiled, then coughed softly. Her hand trembled as she pushed the wet cloak aside. The face beneath it was thinner, older, worn by time, but still holding the same light he remembered. Elias stepped closer, reached out to touch her shoulder, then hesitated halfway. "I thought you forgot the way home." She shook her head. "I thought so too. But the rain made me remember. I promised you, didn't I?" They stood there a long while, letting the storm fill the silence for them. Elias brought out an old blanket and draped it over her shoulders. The scent of wet wood, rain, and her damp hair blended into something that felt like memory itself. She told him where she'd been, working in Santa Fe, traveling with trade wagons down south, falling ill, getting back up again. Every year when it rained, she thought of the little cabin and the man on the porch who might still be waiting. "I didn't come back sooner because I was afraid," she said. "Afraid you wouldn't be there anymore." "And I stayed," he replied, "because I was afraid that if I left, you'd come back and not find me." The night slowly quieted. Elias lit the fire and set an old kettle on the stove. Lydia sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes glowing warm in the firelight. She looked around the cabin. Almost everything was the same as the day she left. "You kept the same chair?" He nodded. "It didn't break. And it kept waiting." She laughed, a small laugh, but enough to warm the whole room. They talked for hours, sharing the pieces of the years they'd lost. Not to blame, but to fill the space between them. Outside, the rain softened, gentler now, as if listening. When Lydia finally fell asleep on the chair, Elias watched her for a long time. Her brown hair, once so bright, now carried strands of silver. Her face showed every mile she had walked. But to him, she was still the Lydia from that summer afternoon long ago. The woman at the fence who told him she'd return when the first rain came. He whispered, barely audible, "I've waited my whole life to hear this rain." The next morning, Redwood Bluff looked different somehow. The clouds had thinned. The air was clean. Sunlight shimmered in puddles like glass. People walking by saw two figures on the porch. Elias pouring coffee, Lydia sitting beside him wrapped in a wool scarf, smiling softly. No one said a word, but everyone in town understood. The rain had brought something back. Not just a woman, but the faith Elias had folded into every day of waiting. A few days after the rain, the sky over Redwood Bluff turned impossibly clear. No more gray clouds, no more dry wind. Just warm, honest sunlight stretching across the roofs, the porch steps, and the wild grass along the fence line. People in town said the rain had changed their luck that year, and maybe the one who brought it back was the same person who returned with it. But to Elias Boone, none of it was a miracle. It was a promise that had survived 25 years of red dust. Lydia was still weak, but every morning she sat on the porch watching Elias make coffee, the steam curling upward and mixing with the sunlight. They didn't talk much. There was only the soft tick of an old clock, the quiet clink of cups, and the sound of wind brushing past the tin roof. It felt like they were learning how to live together again. Not the way young people do, with fire and recklessness, but with the kind of peace only age and longing can teach. One morning Lydia said, "You know, Eli, I once thought I'd never be able to come back. Every place I went had wind and dust, but nowhere smelled like this house." Elias chuckled, his voice low and rough as dry timber. "Maybe because this place never forgot you." People in Redwood Bluff started stopping by again. Martha brought fresh bread. The blacksmith left a new chair for Elias. Kids stood at the edge of the yard whispering, "So she really came back?" Elias just smiled. Yes, she really came back. But not as she once was. She tired easily, walked slowly, and when the cold settled in, her hands shook too much to hold a cup. Elias knew time had taken plenty from her, but he also knew there were things it could never touch, like the way she looked at him when the afternoon light bent across the porch. In early July, Lydia asked to walk out to the field. He helped her up the hill behind the house, where they had planted a little oak tree the day before she left. Now it stood taller than both of them, casting a wide patch of shade. Lydia touched the trunk, her eyes glistening. "I thought it would have died." Elias answered, "It lived because someone promised to water it." She looked at him and smiled softly. "You kept watering it." "Yeah," he said. "It's proof you were here." From that day on, every evening they sat beneath the oak, listening to the crickets and the dry grass scent drifting through the breeze. She told him about the years she spent away, nights in cheap inns, mornings with strangers, and storms that made her cry without knowing why. Elias didn't speak much. He just listened. Sometimes he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, like touching a dream he was afraid to break. Some evenings, Lydia went quiet for a long time. Her gaze stretched toward the horizon. "Did you ever get angry with me?" she asked once. He shook his head. No. I only got angry at myself for not going after you." She smiled. "If you had, who would have been here to wait?" He chuckled softly. "Probably nobody." Life in Redwood Bluff slowed down. People got used to seeing smoke rise from the cabin each morning, and to the sight of two older souls sitting side by side on the porch. When folks walked past, Elias greeted them with a warm, steady voice. Little by little, the town stopped calling him the crazy one and started calling him something else. The man who kept his promise. One evening, when the sunset turned the valley red, Lydia whispered, "Eli, if one day I'm not here anymore, will you still sit out and wait for the sun to rise?" He looked at her and smiled. "If you leave again, I'll wait again. But this time, I won't need the rain, just the sunlight." She laughed through quiet tears. "Then I'll try to stay as long as I can, so you don't have to wait anymore." And so that summer drifted by, slow and gentle, the way two people love when they're tired of time but still know how to care. Not grand gestures, not big declarations, just a cup of tea, a folded blanket, a shared silence as the light changed across the window. People say some love stories don't need to start over because they never truly ended. Elias and Lydia were proof of that. In Redwood Bluff, the sun still filtered through the old trees. Sparrows still hopped along the porch rail, and folks still talked about the man who waited 25 years to keep a promise. And how, in the end, that promise came home with the first sunshine after the rain. Autumn came early to Redwood Bluff. The oak leaves on the hill faded into pale gold, then scattered across the wind, settling on the porch where the two of them once sat. The cabin still smelled like morning coffee, but Lydia no longer rose with the dawn. She tired easily now, slept longer. Her voice grew soft, almost a whisper at times. Elias kept his old routine anyway. Every morning he made 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her chair, even though he knew she might not be strong enough to drink it. One morning, just as the sun touched the window, he heard the faint rustle of paper inside the room. Lydia was sitting at the table holding an old quill pen that had long dried out. He stepped closer and asked gently, "What are you writing, Ly?" She smiled, tired but tender. "A letter. I've meant to write it for years, but I kept putting it off." Elias sat beside her, but she shook her head. "Don't read it while I'm still here, Eli. Read it on a morning without rain. Promise me." He nodded. He didn't ask questions. Some words, he knew, were meant to be written for the sake of the writer, not the reader. The days that followed were harder. Lydia slept more often. Elias rarely left the house. When she rested, he sat by her bed holding her hand. When she woke, he told her about the oak tree on the hill, the sparrow nest under the porch, and how townsfolk talked about them like a real-life story that sounded almost like a myth. She listened with her eyes closed, smiling faintly. "I want to be buried under that oak, Eli," she said one afternoon. "I don't want to go far anymore." He squeezed her hand, his voice breaking. "I promise." Then came a morning in October when Lydia slipped away quietly. No harsh wind, no storm, no sound at all. Just sunlight falling across the thin blanket and the glow of a new day she would never see. Elias sat at her bedside until the sun rose high. He didn't call for anyone. He just stayed there, as if waiting for her to open her eyes again and ask, "Did you make the coffee?" When people finally arrived, they found him holding a folded piece of paper, Lydia's letter. The paper was slightly creased, the handwriting slanted and shaky, but clear enough to read every word. He opened it slowly and read, "Eli, if you are reading this, it means I've gone to a place where time finally stops chasing me. I don't want you to be sad. In my whole life, there were 2 things I could never manage to do: keep you from hurting and stay away from you completely. I used to fear being forgotten, but you taught me that some people don't have to stay to keep living in someone's heart. I didn't come back for forgiveness. I came back to keep my promise, that I would return when the sky found mercy for us again. And it did, didn't it? The rain fell, and I found you still sitting there, still believing. If there's a next life, I pray I get to be the one who walks behind you, just so I can watch you turn back. Don't wait anymore, Eli. Live the rest of your life as if I'm still sitting on the porch, listening to you talk about the afternoons. Yours, Lydia. Elias folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He simply breathed, letting the quiet settle over him like a blanket. On the day of her burial, the entire town came. No one spoke much. They stood around the big oak tree watching as Elias placed each handful of dirt into the grave with his own hands. Then he laid the letter inside the coffin, beside her, saying softly, "You sent it, Lie, and I received it." After that day, Elias no longer sat alone on the porch each morning. He went to the hill instead. He sat under the oak, reading lines from her letter in a low voice as if speaking to someone still sitting there beside him. Sometimes children saw him smiling at nothing and asked, "Who are you talking to, Mr. Boone?" He'd answer, "To someone who never really went far." Winter settled in. The oak shed its leaves, but small purple wildflowers appeared around its roots. The color Lydia always loved. Folks said those flowers only grow when the ground is warm and someone is remembering. And every morning, Elias carried a warm cup of coffee to the hill. He sat beneath the oak, facing the horizon where the rain once came from, where she once returned. In Redwood Bluff, people still tell the story of the man they once called crazy. A man who loved in a way few people ever have, with time, patience, and belief. And how sometimes love doesn't need to be sent anywhere. It only needs to be kept. Many years passed after the day Lydia left for the last time. Redwood Bluff stayed small and quiet with its single dirt road into town, its old church, and a handful of porches worn down by sun and time. But whenever anyone mentioned the crazy man who waited for the rain, they no longer said it with pity. They said it with respect and a little warmth in their voices. Elias Boone had grown frail. His back had bent, his eyes had dimmed, and his hands trembled whenever he poured his morning coffee. Still, every day he made the slow walk up the hill behind his house, where the oak tree spread wide and cast its shade across the valley. He talked to Lydia as if she were sitting right beside him. He told her how the town's children had grown up and moved away, how the old blacksmith had become a grandfather, and sometimes he just sat quietly listening to the wind move through the leaves, believing that was her way of answering. One late autumn afternoon, the wind blew stronger than usual. The last light of the day slid across the porch, turning everything gold as it touched the faded picture frames on the walls. Elias rested in his chair, watching that light with a distant look in his eyes. He heard a soft sound, like a door easing open, and then a voice he knew better than his own, gentle and clear as if carried by the breeze. "Did you make the coffee, Eli?" He smiled without turning his head. "I did, Lie, same as every morning." A sparrow landed on the railing and chirped once or twice. The golden light drifted across Elias's face, and he closed his eyes with that smile still there, soft and peaceful. When Martha Hale came by the next morning, she found Elias gone. He was sitting in his old chair, the coffee cup still warm on the table beside him. Martha swore he passed just as the sun rose, its first rays shining straight through the doorway where Lydia used to stand. The whole town came to his funeral. No one cried loudly. They simply bowed their heads and placed small purple flowers on the ground beneath the oak, where two graves now rested side by side facing west. On Elias's stone, they carved the 4 words he used to say, "I kept my promise." And every year, when the first rain fell on Redwood Bluff, some swore they could hear a quiet laugh drifting down from the hill. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was memory. But in the last light of day, when the sun touched the oak leaves just right, the whole town seemed to glow as if that love had never once left this place. And maybe, just maybe, it never did. They say love isn't measured by the years we spend together, but by the promises we keep when no one is watching. Elias Boone did something the world called foolish, something most folks would never understand. He waited for a woman for 25 years. Yet sometimes the foolish things are the very ones that make a life worth living. Lydia came back, not at the right time, and not with the youth she once had, but in the exact moment when love still had a place to grow. And when Elias closed his eyes in the last light of day, I don't believe he truly left. I believe he simply rose to follow the path she had taken, to a place where there is no waiting, only peace. If tonight's story made you think of someone, or made your heart fall quiet for a moment, maybe love is still alive in you, just as it lived on in Redwood Bluff. Hit subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories about love, about faith, and about promises that never die. Because out here in the West, between the wind, the dust, and the fading light, there is always someone waiting and someone finding their way home.